Would you like to be a king? Not of a fairy tale land, but, say, of the United Kingdom. But don't rush to answer just yet. What do you really know about the lives of monarchs? How do those live whose existence is like being under a glass dome? What secrets do they hide in their dark closets? And is someone truly happy just because they were born into a royal family? Can kings really do everything? Let's try to pull back the curtain on one of the world's most famous royal families, one that continues to captivate not just Europeans, but people around the world. This family's history has had it all: affairs and romantic intrigues, political conflicts, betrayals, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. I think you've already guessed that we're talking about the House of Windsor. Why does this royal family still attract so much attention? Let's try to figure it out, and along the way, we'll discover who brought glory to the crown and whose name became a stain on its reputation, who valued love above all else, and who chose the throne and politics instead. So, let's begin. On September 8, 2022, the world was shaken by the news. Queen Elizabeth II passed away at the age of 96, having sat on the throne for more than 70 years. Her son, Charles, ascended to the throne as King Charles III. But how important is his role in today's world? The United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy, meaning that the king is the head of state but does not hold real political power. The country is led and represented on the international stage by the Prime Minister. The royal family, in turn, plays a ceremonial and symbolic role in the nation's identity. But when did everything change? At what point in history did Britain become something different? After all, the Windsors were once the most powerful dynasty in the world. To get a better understanding, let's rewind the history of the monarchy a little. No, we won't go as far back as the Tudors or the Stuarts. We'll start a bit closer, in the 1830s. The world was gradually recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, and Russia, as the victorious power, played a crucial role in European affairs. Its main rival was Great Britain, with its vast colonial empire. But things weren't entirely smooth in the land of fog. On the throne for nearly 60 years was King George III of the House of Hanover. He was in constant conflict with Parliament over the extent of royal authority. It was under George III that the United States came into existence. His reign saw the American colonies break away from the British Crown after winning the War of Independence. The king himself suffered from severe health issues. He had rheumatism, went blind from cataracts in his later years, and eventually lost his sanity. The ailing king was only a figurehead, with regents ruling in his stead. That was not the case, however, for his granddaughter, Victoria, who would go on to become one of the most famous and influential figures in British history. It must be said that English kings, once they ascended the throne, often led rather debauched lives and indulged excessively in alcohol. Perhaps for this reason, the Hanoverian dynasty saw an increasing number of sickly children who did not live long. One of King George III's sons hoped that his own healthy child would inherit the throne. The fact that it was a girl did not concern anyone. Queens had ruled the country before. The princess was named Victoria and was raised with strict discipline and obedience. She was to remain physically healthy, pure in soul, and free from unworthy desires. Her mother was so protective that she even slept in the same room as Victoria, despite the fact that the girl was already 14 years old. Did you know that the future queen's godfather was the Russian Emperor Alexander I? At that time, Russia and England were still allies, but more on that later. After the deaths of several heirs, 18-year-old Victoria inherited the throne. This marked the beginning of a new era, later known as the Victorian Age. Under her rule, Britain would become a global superpower, and the Industrial Revolution would transform everyday life, but all of that was still to come. For now, just after ascending the throne, Victoria dismissed all former servants and ladies-in-waiting who had been involved in immoral behavior. For her, morality and nobility were not just words. 2 years later, Victoria did something rare for monarchs. She married for love. Her chosen one was her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was, in fact, quite handsome and had impeccable manners. The moment Victoria met him, she fell in love, and just 3 days later, she proposed to him. Yes, you heard that right. According to protocol, no one could propose to the queen, she had to do it herself. Albert gladly accepted. He was also fond of Victoria and admired her strength of character and intelligence. By the way, it was Victoria who made the white wedding dress a tradition. Before her, brides wore dresses of any color, but after her wedding, white became the symbol of purity and innocence. Once again, the British throne was occupied by a German dynasty. But no one was particularly bothered by this. National origin was not the deciding factor when it came to choosing monarchs. Ironically, by the start of World War I, nearly all of Europe's ruling monarchs were related to each other and belonged to the House of Coburg. Perhaps that's why they waged war so ruthlessly. But for now, let's focus on Albert and Victoria. They spent 21 years together and raised 9 children, whom they adored. Theirs was an ideal family, without scandals or infidelity, built on mutual respect and strong family traditions. Their greatest love was reserved for their eldest son, the heir to the throne, Edward VII. Unfortunately, excessive parental affection often leads to tragic consequences. Why does this happen? When a child becomes the main value in a family, it's a very bad thing. If a child's desires are always fulfilled, be prepared for them to grow up selfish, lazy, and irresponsible. That's what happened with Victoria and Albert's eldest son, Edward, whom the family affectionately called Bertie. Great expectations were placed on him, but sadly, he completely failed to meet them. As a child, his parents tried to give Bertie the best education, but he was temperamental and lazy. Moreover, his lessons sometimes stretched into the late hours, which exhausted and irritated the heir to the throne. When Bertie turned 17, he was sent to Oxford. But once freed from his parents' watchful eye, he completely neglected his studies. Bertie became involved in gambling, cigars, and betting on horse races. It should be said that Bertie inherited a handsome appearance from his father, and he was sociable with a good sense of humor. It's no surprise that before long, he was being noticed in society among beautiful women, and sometimes even married ones. Scandalous gossip about the heir's behavior reached the royal family. Albert, Bertie's father, held serious talks with him, but they were as ineffective as a grain of sand to an elephant. Edward continued his reckless lifestyle despite his father's reproaches. In an attempt to discipline him and instill some sense of order, his parents sent him to the army. It was a peaceful time, so Bertie was supposed to learn military tactics in Ireland. But the future king showed total disrespect for the rules. He kept a courtesan in his room. This became a shameful stain on the royal family's reputation, which had always upheld puritanical morals and values. When this became known, Victoria tried to reason with Bertie, but it changed nothing. Albert was so shocked by his son's behavior that he even called him a corrupt weakling. A few weeks later, Albert died of typhoid, and Victoria blamed Bertie, believing his actions had pushed his father to such an end. The queen barely survived this blow, but quietly came to hate her son, considering him foolish and immature. For the rest of her life, she would keep her distance from Bertie, reluctant to hand over the throne, believing her son could not bear such responsibility. Hoping to tame her son's wild nature and completely ignoring his opinion, Victoria arranged for Bertie to marry 18-year-old Danish princess Alexandra. It's worth noting that Alexandra's younger sister, Dagmar, later took the name Maria and became the wife of Russian Tsar Alexander III and the mother of Nicholas II. By the way, Queen Victoria was known as the grandmother of Europe because she married off her children to members of royal families across the old world. Her descendants ruled in Germany, Russia, Spain, Norway, and other countries. Bertie's wife, Alexandra, turned out to be intelligent, cheerful, and easy to get along with, and together they enjoyed the social life of London. However, over time, Bertie grew bored of the marriage, and after having 2 children, he returned to his old habits, frequently visiting the Parisian brothel Le Chabonais. There, he had a private room with a luxurious bathtub, which was filled with champagne for the future king's enjoyment with ladies of the night. Interestingly, in 1946, when the brothel closed, this bathtub was bought by Salvador Dali. Scandals involving married women followed one after another, and in 1890, the British press expressed deep outrage over the behavior of the heir to the throne. Nevertheless, Bertie was not deterred. He continued his affairs with beautiful women from high society and actresses, including Sarah Bernhardt. His last mistress would be Alice Keppel, a woman who was 28 years younger than him, had a husband and daughter, and who would have a strong influence on the future king, continuing the affair until his death. In 1901, Queen Victoria passed away. Her son would be the only person in Britain not to mourn his mother's passing because now Bertie, Edward VII, was king of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Due to his bad reputation, many believed he would be a weak ruler. But Edward VII surprised everyone. Very soon, the king would be loved for his cheerful temperament, personal charm, and excellent diplomatic skills. He would mend relations with England's longtime adversaries, France and Russia. Edward VII and Tsar Nicholas II signed an agreement that would later become the foundation for the creation of the Triple Entente, the alliance between Russia, Britain, and France. For this, Edward VII would be given the nickname Uncle of Europe, as the Russian Tsar and his wife were his niece and nephew. Edward VII passed away in 1910 at the age of 68, learning just before his death that he had won a bet on the horse races. At his funeral, 2 women would stand by his coffin, his wife and his mistress Alice. Remember this name, we will mention it again, and it will be connected to this royal family. In 1891, Edward VII, then still Bertie, lost his eldest son, the heir to the throne, Albert, to the flu. Now, the next in line for the throne was his second son, George, or George, as he was called in the family. He was a calm, quiet man who had no desire to become king, understanding that this role already belonged to his older brother. As a child, George was often ill, and his parents, believing in the benefits of sea air, sent the young prince to serve as a midshipman aboard a cruiser. On the ship, George was treated just like the other cadets, without any special privileges due to his lineage. He washed floors, woke up early, and stood watch. George served in the British Navy for 14 years, sailing from Australia to Canada, and decided to dedicate his life to a military career. George V would be the last British monarch who truly knew what it was like to be an officer. However, after his brother's death, he had to prepare for the throne. This became a real challenge for him. Unlike his brother, George was not a brilliant speaker and did not enjoy high society life, but he was responsible and serious. His grandmother, Queen Victoria, chose his bride for him. She arranged for him to marry the fiancée of his late brother, and this marriage turned out to be a happy one. George had a strong attachment to his grandmother, the Queen. She was his role model, and when he became King George V, he decided to follow her political course. To honor her memory, it was decided that no future Queen of England would ever bear the name Victoria. In the family of George, strict Victorian rules prevailed: no affairs, honesty, order, and respect for one another. George considered himself a regular statesman, dreaming of a peaceful, quiet reign without any reforms or upheavals. Everything should be as it was with Grandma. The King of Britain often visited his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, with whom he shared a strong physical resemblance. George would try to convince his cousin of his friendship and loyalty, but as we know, these were just words. When the revolution began in Russia, George V could have saved his cousin and his family. However, fearing civil unrest, he chose not to intervene and eventually distanced himself from them. As a result, the Romanovs were executed. But that would come later. Now, on the horizon, World War I was approaching, one of the most challenging periods in history. In 1914, the reshaping of the world began. The Entente and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, went to war, a conflict that would later involve 38 nations. George V wasn't very knowledgeable about politics, but he understood that in difficult times, something had to be done to unite the people. And the early 20th century was a time of national romanticism, where people sought independence and national self-determination. So, what did it take for every Briton to feel like part of one nation? The king, so to speak, went to the people. He personally visited the active army, hospitals, and military bases, sometimes even under bombings. He even became a teetotaler, setting an example for the British Army, where drunkenness was a common practice. People loved George V, considering him one of their own. But there was still one small yet important and dangerous issue in the royal family's biography. Remember, we talked about how, for centuries, it didn't matter what nationality the king was. But now, everything had changed. People began to identify with their country. So, if Germany was at war with Britain, then the British were against the Germans. And what were the king's roots? From which dynasty did he come? Correct. From a German dynasty. The family name was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. What if, suddenly, the public, with its anti-German sentiment, turned against him? The spirit of revolution was already in the air. So, George V decided to abandon the family name. In 1917, his family became the Windsors, named after one of the king's favorite castles. This surname is still used by the British monarchy today. A year later, the war ended, and with it, the end of 4 world empires. George V's flexible politics allowed him to preserve the monarchy in Britain, though the country lost global influence and some of its colonies. After the war, George V actively supported ordinary Britons. He understood that times were changing and adaptation was necessary. The king didn't like technological progress, but in 1932, he was the first to record a radio message to his subjects, a tradition that continues today. By the way, the text of this message was written for him by the famous Rudyard Kipling, the literary father of Mowgli. To show that the king cared about the people, he would meet with workers and listen to their problems. Unfortunately, while caring for the people, George completely forgot about his own children. They grew up without attention and love, and this would come back to haunt him later. In 1929, the Great Depression reached the shores of Britain, but it didn't cause much damage, except to Ireland, which would later leave the UK. Politically, things were also calm. The people trusted their king, who had become a symbol of confidence and stability. George V himself was cautious in his dealings with the people. He stopped exercising his rights as the ruler of the state, shifting all responsibility onto Parliament. It was under George V that the monarchy would lose its power entirely, becoming just a traditional symbol of the country. Presidents and prime ministers are elected, and they now bear responsibility for the welfare and crises of the nation, while kings no longer need to be overthrown or fight for power. They now live for themselves, becoming a part of a centuries-old history that can't be easily discarded. Since this is part of history, events within royal families naturally attract widespread attention. The king's personal life is always in the spotlight, like in a reality show. In 1936, George V died, and the heir to the throne became his eldest son, Edward VIII. Since childhood, the boy felt the pressure of his status and often rebelled against the strict rules of the royal family. His nanny would not only scold him, but sometimes even hit him. Complaining to his parents was useless. They didn't take it seriously. In the family, modesty and patience were valued, while the young prince dreamed of lively parties and wealth. He received a brilliant education, served in the army during World War I, but always preferred a carefree life to the strict duties of a monarch. He loved to travel, form friendships and romantic connections, and make appearances in society, which often irritated his father, who once said, "After my death, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." This phrase would prove to be prophetic. The young prince was handsome, imposing, kind, and pleasant to talk to, so the people of Britain sympathized with him. The press of the time called him the star of parties and a trendsetter. Needless to say, Edward had no shortage of female attention. Many young women dreamed of him, and he began one romance after another, just like his grandfather, also named Edward. However, he managed to avoid any scandalous stories. The prince delayed marriage for a long time, which upset the family. But at the age of 36, Edward met American Wallis Simpson. While she wasn't exactly a beauty, her charm, elegance, and intelligence captivated Edward. Their romance developed quickly, and by the time George V died, Edward was already openly living with Wallis. All seemed well. But the problem was that the prince's chosen one was divorced and had already remarried. When Edward ascended the throne, a full-blown scandal broke out. According to the traditions of the Anglican Church, the king could not marry a divorced woman with living ex-husbands. Politicians, the church, and society all strongly disapproved of this union. No one even dared to think that a British king would marry an American woman without aristocratic roots, and on top of that, a divorced woman. Accepting this would have been like admitting the collapse of the dynasty. But Edward was persistent. He couldn't live without his Wallis. And so, he was faced with a choice, the throne or love. What would you have chosen in his place? Have you thought about it? Edward, without hesitation, gave up the throne, reigning for less than a year, just as his father had predicted. And so, the heir to the throne became the second son of George V, Albert George VI. As you can see, the royal family doesn't have much imagination when it comes to names. So, what happened to Edward after he gave up the crown for the woman he loved? His future life will surprise you just as much. Edward was given the title of Duke and sent far away from his home. Becoming a free man, he married his Wallis, although the new king, George VI, had stripped her of the title of Duchess. This deeply offended the young couple, but it didn't overshadow their life. Both of them loved to travel, and they immediately went to Nazi Germany. As it would later be revealed, the former king of the United Kingdom and his wife were sympathetic to the Nazis. A photograph would surface showing Edward meeting with Hitler and his associates. In the photo, Edward is seen raising his arm in a Nazi salute. Needless to say, a huge scandal erupted in the British royal family. There were even rumors that if Hitler had won, Edward would have put the crown back on. In reality, Edward was terrified of war. So, he and his wife first moved to Spain and then to Portugal, from where he engaged in talks about peaceful coexistence. Soon, George VI appointed his brother as the governor of the Bahamas. It's hard to say that this position pleased Edward, who considered the Bahamas one of the less prestigious British colonies, but he would try to carry out reforms, which would be mostly ineffective. Edward understood that this position was an exile appointed by the British government to keep him away from politics. In 1945, he was allowed to leave his post as governor, and he spent the rest of his life in France with his wife. The couple had no children. Edward would later communicate with relatives, but the relationship remained very cold. For the royal family, he would always be the apostate and traitor who dealt a terrible blow to its prestige by abdicating the throne. And what about King George VI of Britain, Albert, as a child? What kind of legacy did he leave in the royal family? Let's start by saying that he wasn't supposed to become king, but he ended up being one of the most successful monarchs. As a child, Albert, who was left-handed, was made to unlearn it and was even slapped on the hands. The shy, sickly child became nervously stuttered due to such lessons. Later, he grew up and matured. During World War I, he served in the Royal Navy and decided early on to start a family. Interestingly, Albert met his future wife Elizabeth when he was 10 years old. At a celebration, the 5-year-old girl stole cherries from the cake and offered them to the prince. Albert remembered the incident. But first, Albert had a brief affair with a married woman. It seems to be some family curse. But when his father found out about it, he insisted on ending the relationship, which was bringing shame to the family. This is when the modest Albert, unlike his older brother, obeyed his father, earning his considerable respect. The prince showed that family values and the well-being of his family were his priorities. He broke up with his mistress. Soon, Albert met Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and was charmed by her. The girl had a higher education, played sports, and loved animals. Albert didn't mind that Elizabeth came from a noble Scottish family without royal blood. By that time, this had stopped being important. Dynastic marriages had become a thing of the past along with Queen Victoria. And after World War I, as you remember, there were no more ruling dynasties. It's worth mentioning that the young woman didn't immediately agree to become Albert's wife. She liked him, but the intense attention to the royal family was a concern. However, Albert was persistent, and 2 years later, the world watched the royal wedding. It was a strong marriage. 3 years later, the couple had a daughter, Elizabeth, and 4 years later, a second daughter, Margaret. Albert was a good father. He loved his daughters and often spoiled them. He gave his eldest daughter Elizabeth, who would later become Queen Elizabeth II, a lovely corgi puppy. The Queen would love dogs, especially that breed, for the rest of her life. In 1939, George VI became the first British monarch to visit the United States, and his image appeared on banknotes in the UK, Canada, and Australia. The king was close to the people. During World War II, he stayed in London, meeting with its residents and visiting munitions factories. His family, just like the civilian population, hid from bombings and used ration cards. A quiet, calm man, the spare prince, who was able to inspire the nation during tough times, became a symbol of national unity. But there were two drawbacks that tarnished the image of the ideal king. Firstly, George VI stammered, and any speech was a challenge for him, yet a monarch needs to communicate and speak in public often. This issue was solved with the help of his wife and a speech therapist. George worked on it for many years and soon stopped stuttering. Secondly, the king was a heavy smoker. He started smoking in university and never managed to quit this harmful habit. It eventually led to his downfall. In 1952, George VI died of lung cancer. He was greatly respected and loved. On the day of his funeral, Britain bid farewell to its king with a long moment of silence, and passengers flying from New York to London stood up from their seats on the plane. Now, the crown rightfully passed to his daughter, Elizabeth II. Before her coronation, the princess was asked about her choice of a name, to which she replied, "I like my name. I will keep it." Thus, at the age of 25, Elizabeth II became the Queen of the United Kingdom. Even as a child, the king's eldest daughter was serious and responsible. The princess was raised with strictness and received a good home education. Although she didn't attend university, unlike previous kings, this didn't stop her from becoming a symbol of royal authority. Elizabeth's character showed itself during World War II when she drove trucks and visited wounded soldiers in hospitals with her mother. She inherited from her father the principle, family is more important than anything, and she always followed it. Interestingly, when you begin studying British monarchs, you encounter a fact: many of them in the 20th century didn't really want to become kings and queens. Everything had to be done according to tradition, strictly following the protocol. Your entire life was under the constant attention of cameras and the press. Elizabeth II realized her place in society as a child and accepted it. Her whole life, she carried the burden of public life, rarely giving interviews. In 1947, the princess married Philip, the son of a Greek prince. George VI didn't like his son-in-law. He didn't like that Philip's sisters were married to Nazis, but this was soon forgotten. Upon ascending the throne, the queen realized that she had inherited an empire that had been significantly battered by war and crises, but she couldn't influence the political or economic life of the country. Her opinion in the government was of no interest, and sometimes Elizabeth wasn't even listened to. The queen patiently accepted this situation while maintaining the dignity of the dynasty. This could not be said of her younger sister Margaret. Margaret completely disregarded the family traditions and all protocols. She loved luxurious parties, smoked, drank, had affairs with married men, and was often seen in scandalous newspaper articles. Sound familiar? And again, despite this, the people loved her. Values had changed. Later, Margaret would calm down and marry, but her past wouldn't leave her. The press would continue to follow her life, discussing her struggles with alcohol and health. All of this would embarrass the royal family. But this was just the beginning. Now it's time to talk about the most scandalous period of the Windsor reign. It was the end of the 20th century. Television was taking over the world, celebrities became closer. And in the Windsor family, there was a wedding. Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer, the daughter of Earl John Spencer. How many scandals will be associated with this name? Princess Diana, who never became queen, attracts global attention by trying to be first in everything, even breaking centuries-old traditions. She becomes the first bride to have a paid job before her engagement. She removes the phrase about the wife's submission to her husband from the family vow, and Diana and Charles's 2 children are born not at home, but in the hospital. Can you feel the loud crash as the traditional order in the royal family is being torn apart? Diana and Charles's marriage will be unhappy. Their 2 sons, William and Harry, do not strengthen the marriage but, on the contrary, become the source of new scandals in the royal family. Diana devoted a lot of time and energy to her children. The world will fall in love with Princess Diana, calling her the Queen of Hearts. She will become a fighter for justice, a style icon for many women, but most importantly, she will constantly communicate with the media, and her popularity will surpass even the Queen herself. And can you imagine, such a thing could never be allowed. Her husband, Charles, who loves solitude and peace, tries to avoid noisy companies and interactions with the press. But it's Charles who will be the first to openly admit on television to his affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana won't publicly announce her affairs, the paparazzi will do that. In their attempt to discredit each other, Charles and Diana will stage public confrontations. One day, Diana will publicly declare that Charles will never be a good king. Can you imagine how this struck at the reputation of the royal family? Elizabeth despises her daughter-in-law and asks Charles to divorce her, which he does immediately. Now, the public sees Diana as a victim, someone who suffered at the hands of the Windsors. Perhaps this was later forgotten, but then a tragedy happened. Diana died in a car crash. Her death is still shrouded in mystery, a mystery that no one has yet uncovered. Charles and his mistress were never forgiven for Diana's death. The monarch was accused of being stiff and outdated. So, what happened to the children of Diana and Charles? Let's just say their childhood was difficult. First, there were constant family conflicts, then the divorce of their parents, and the death of their mother. The younger son, Harry, suffered the most. He was initially seen as the second and unloved by Charles. As for the elder William, it's clear, someday he will sit on the throne, though life is unpredictable. But for now, Harry is just the understudy. But even he managed to get caught up in scandals. As a teenager, he attended a party wearing a shirt with a swastika, and later began dating American Meghan Markle, another American in the royal family. Remember, Wallis Simpson, the one for whom Edward gave up the throne. The spiral of history is an interesting thing. Scholars argue it doesn't exist, but how can we explain that exactly 100 years later, members of the dynasty, according to protocol, get into similar scandals? And Charles's mistress, and now his wife, Camilla Parker Bowles, is the great-granddaughter of Alice. Yes, that Alice, Edward VI's lover. Cool, right? So what do you think? Just coincidences or something else? And the history of the royal dynasty is not over yet. On the British throne sits King Charles III, Charles, the eldest son of Elizabeth II, and his wife, with William and Harry's families living at court. And it's still unknown what stories they will bring to the forefront about their lineage, and whether we, the common people, will find it interesting. So, do you still want to become a king?